Now, Ghazali continues after the passage which we just heard by suggesting that the formulas of dhikr, whether they be Quranic or the 99 names or whatever, that the formulas of dhikr which bring us up to exalted states of awareness of God's presence have to be chosen with great care and by an expert. The soul, he says, is a vulnerable thing. It's a tender thing in man. And the higher one attains in one's spiritual life, the more dangerous will be a fall. Each formula has been given a particular property or a power by God. So there has to be a spiritual guide who is like a trained heart surgeon who carefully chooses from the various surgical instruments that these formulas of dhikr represent. Each one he will recognize is for a particular task, suited to a particular individual, perhaps suitable for a particular time of day or time of the year. Again, a sophisticated science. The mystic Ibn Khafif, for instance, in the 4th century, we find him saying, "The recollected one is one, but the forms of recollection are many, and the conditions of the hearts of those who recollect are legion." So because of the complexity of the states of the human soul, far more complex, in fact, than the states and disorders that can overcome the human body, because of this complexity, there has to be a sophisticated spiritual guide, as there is in any tradition of mysticism. So Islamic spirituality affirms the importance of what it calls Irshad, spiritual guidance by a living individual. So we find Rumi telling us, whoever travels without a guide needs 200 years for a 2-day journey. And once one has found the guide, one has to treat him with obedience, accept his insights and his instructions concerning one's spiritual life. Ghazali even says, "Let the aspirant hold fast to his teacher in the way that a blind man might clutch his guide on a riverbank, putting himself entirely in his hands and never disobeying his instructions." So those Muslims who are within the inner circle of the concentric circles I drew for you earlier, the people who aspire to ihsan, must, as a condition for their spiritual progress, submit to a qualified guide, a perfected saint who has himself traversed the distance and knows the dangers of the route. A famous Persian writer, Abdurrahman Jami, put it in these terms: "All the prophets came to open people's eyes to their own faults and to God's perfection, their own weaknesses and God's power, their own injustice and God's justice. And the spiritual guide is also there for the purpose of opening the eyes of his disciples." So in a sense, the saint or the spiritual guide is filling in for the prophet who is no longer with us, just as the prophet was not just the political leader, but also the spiritual guide of the companions, many of whom became saints of extraordinary luminosity and generosity. So also the saint will emulate the prophet and take upon himself this responsibility of guiding erring humanity. Now, everybody recognized that the path to God is difficult, narrow, and hazardous. Progress is unlikely unless you take the hand of a master who's made the journey himself or herself, because it's worth acknowledging that in the tradition, a perfected saint or perfected guide can be a woman. And we know that the medieval Saint Ibn Arabi, for example, regarded by many as the supreme Muslim mystical writer, his first 3 spiritual teachers were actually women. I mean, it's not an uncommon thing. And the function of the guide is not to take anything for himself. He doesn't claim remuneration or any honor or anything for this. He is simply there to liberate us from the lower possibilities of the human condition. And to do this, he may have to be very patient with us, and the process may take a lot of time. And his function is simply to inculcate in us this virtue of dhikr, not to turn us into something that we are not, but to remind us and to reorient ourselves back towards that primordial nature of orientation towards God with which we are born. There's a nice medieval Persian story I have here. Somebody would like to read it out? Perhaps a lady? Yeah.
The mystics of Islam tell the story of a lion striding through the mountains. who one day saw a ridiculous spectacle. A lion cub was shuffling along and thawing like a sheep. With a great roar, the lion ran down the hillside, scattered the flock of sheep, grabbed the lion cub, dragged it into a pond, and forced it to look into the pond. "Look," it said, "you are not a sheep, you are like me, you are a lion. You're a lion and you have the truth, the sincerity, the passion, and the generosity of a lion." Then the lion gave an immense, glorious roar. The cub found himself both terrified and strangely excited by this. The lion turned to the cub and said, "Now you roar." The cub's first attempts were pathetic, mewings, somewhere between a baa and a yell. But slowly, by submitting to the teaching of the lion, the cub grew into claiming his lionhood and began over many years to learn how to roar.
Thank you. So that's a kind of simple metaphor of the function of the spiritual guide. He is there to bring us to our true selves, the theomorphic, primordial condition in which we were when we were with God before our birth. Now, the usual term for a spiritual guide in Islam is the familiar one of sheikh. Feminine is sheikha. Arabic, like many languages, likes to form feminines by adding an A. And the disciple is known as a murid. Again, plural, feminine, murida. And the term which means something like a seeker or an aspirant, and which is usually said to derive from a Quranic verse, which is Surah 6, verse 52. "Do not repel those who call upon their Lord morning and night, aspiring to his face." Now, following the prototype of all Islamic spiritual initiation, which was the pledging of the companions' allegiance to the Prophet, the aspiring novice on the Muslim spiritual path requests bay'ah, which is the initiatic pledge of allegiance to his or her sheikh. And the sheikh may accept him or her as a disciple, or if he decides that the disciple does not suffer from the kind of spiritual sicknesses that he or she knows how to deal with, may well send the aspirant off to somebody else who may be more qualified to deal with those particular ailments. Once the murid has accepted the guidance of the sheikh, he or she will be set certain duties which will help to grind down the coarsenesses of the ego. The most elementary of these duties, and the most important, is of course the recitation of a regular wird, which will be selected for him on the basis of his spiritual needs by the sheikh. But certainly until very recent years, there were also other duties incumbent upon the murid, particularly those who existed within this framework of the zawiyah, the physical space where spiritual aspirants would exist and practice. Typically, for instance, there would be 3 initial years of service. The first would be in the service of others, sweeping, cleaning, cooking, or whatever. The second would be devoted to worship and invocation. And the third would be in meditation and scrutinizing oneself. In each of these different stages, the aspirant would be taught different formulas of dhikr to practice, both on his own and in the presence of others, in the regular gatherings of the sheikh's disciples. Most commonly, you'll find that these are held on Thursday nights. That's fairly typical throughout the Muslim world. That after saying the night prayer in the mosque, Muslims, those of them who are interested in spirituality and have a sheikh, will leave the mosque and will go off to the zawiyah, and then they will have some of the songs and the ceremonies which we heard earlier. And in some places, this is a very spectacular phenomenon indeed, particularly at certain sacred times of the year. If you go to the ceremonies of dhikr that are held to commemorate the birthday of the Prophet's grandson, Al-Hussein, in Cairo, you will see perhaps 1 million people attending these ceremonies of dhikr. It's quite a spectacular event. All of the different spiritual orders will put up brightly coloured tents in the streets of Cairo. The old city will be completely clogged up with these tents. They'll have chairs or they'll sit on the ground, and in each of the tents they'll be reciting their own tradition of songs and whatever. And they're all plugged into the mains electricity, and usually a lot of Cairo suffers power cuts various points in the night because there's so many people there. They come from all over the country. So it can be just 2 or 3 people doing their wird together, or it can be 1 million people.